What if everything we thought we knew about where we came from was written in a language we couldn't read? What if the answer to humanity's oldest question, where did we come from and why are we here, has been sitting in museum basements for over a century, pressed into clay tablets by hands that turned to dust 5,000 years ago, waiting for us to develop the technology to finally understand what they were trying to tell us? What if those tablets don't contain what we expected at all? In laboratories scattered across 3 continents, artificial intelligence systems are now doing something that would have seemed like magic just a decade ago. They're reading cuneiform, that wedge-shaped script pressed into wet clay by ancient Mesopotamian scribes, and translating it into English with startling accuracy. Not the handful of famous texts that scholars have pored over for generations, but tens of thousands of tablets that have never been read by modern eyes. Tablets that have sat in storage since they were excavated from the ruins of Nineveh, from Nippur, from the buried cities of what we now call Iraq. The AI doesn't get tired. It doesn't need decades of training in dead languages. It simply learned the patterns, the grammar, the vocabulary, and begins to speak for voices that have been somnant since before the pyramids were built. And what it's finding is unsettling. Tonight, as your breathing slows and the day releases its grip, we're going to explore what these machines have discovered in the oldest stories ever written. Close your eyes if you'd like. You don't need to follow every detail. Let the ideas wash over you like water over ancient stone. This is for those who wonder, for seekers, for dreamers who suspect that the textbooks left something out. The ground beneath human history is not as solid as we've been told. If this kind of exploration speaks to you, a gentle like helps other wanderers find these stories. Tell me, where are you in the world tonight? What hour finds you seeking mysteries in the dark? The technology itself is remarkable and hard enough to pause over. A team of researchers at Ariel University in Israel, led by Dr. Shea Gordon, trained a neural network on tens of thousands of cuneiform texts. They fed it tablets from the open, richly annotated cuneiform corpus, teaching it to recognize not just individual signs but the grammar and syntax of Akkadian, one of the primary languages of ancient Mesopotamia alongside Sumerian. The system they created operates like a more sophisticated version of Google Translate, but one trained on a language that hasn't been spoken in over 2,000 years. It can take a photograph of a clay tablet covered in wedge marks and produce an English translation in seconds. The accuracy varies, higher for administrative texts with standardized formulas, lower for poetic or literary works, but the implications are staggering. There are an estimated 500,000 cuneiform tablets in museums worldwide. Only a fraction have been translated by human scholars. The bottleneck isn't the tablets themselves, but the small number of experts qualified to read them. With AI, that bottleneck dissolves. One researcher, working independently, created what he calls the AICC, the AI cuneiform corpus, containing over 130,000 translated texts. It's the largest collection of translated cuneiform in the world, created not over decades of scholarly labour, but in months of computational work. The translations aren't perfect. They contain errors, moments where the AI hallucinates, inventing words or phrases that aren't there, but they're readable, they're accessible, and they're opening a door that has been locked since the language died. What's on the other side of that door? Creation stories. Hundreds of them. Variations on themes, accounts of how the world came to be, and more specifically how we came to be. Not the sanitized versions that found their way into textbooks, but the raw originals, complete with details that have sparked intense scholarly debate. These texts can be read multiple ways. Most academic scholars approach them as mythology, theological explanations for the human condition dressed in narrative form. Others see them as political documents, justifying social hierarchies by encoding them in creation stories. Some researchers propose more literal interpretations, suggesting these myths might preserve distorted memories of actual historical events. Each reading has its adherents and its critics. Tonight, we will explore all these perspectives, letting you draw your own conclusions about what these ancient words might mean. The most complete of these stories comes from a text called the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, discovered in the ruins of Nineveh in the mid-1800s. It's written across 7 clay tablets, each one carefully inscribed with about 150 lines of text. The opening words, "When on high," give the epic its name, but the story it tells begins in primordial chaos, before the sky had been named, before the earth beneath bore a name. In the beginning there were only two entities, Apsu, the sweet waters underground, Tiamat, the salt waters of the sea, male and female principles, fresh and bitter, whose waters mingled together in darkness. From their union the first gods emerged, Lachmu and Lahamu representing the powers in silt, then Anshar and Kishar the horizon, then Anu the sky, and from Anu came Ea, also known as Enki, the god of wisdom and deep waters. These younger gods were noisy. They disturbed the ancient silence. Apsu, weary of their clamour, plotted to destroy them. But Ea discovered the plan and cast a spell that caused Apsu to fall into a deep sleep, then killed him. Ea built his dwelling on Apsu's corpse, established shrines, and there with his consort Damkina gave birth to Marduk, a god of such radiance and power that even the other gods marvelled. Tiamat, enraged by her consort's death, created an army of monsters, dragons, storm demons, serpents with venom. She elevated one of the gods, Kingu, to lead them, giving him the Tablet of Destinies which controlled the fundamental laws of the universe. The younger gods, terrified, searched for a champion. Only Marduk stepped forward, but he demanded a price. If he defeated Tiamat, he would be made supreme ruler of all gods. They agreed. The battle was cataclysmic. Marduk caught Tiamat in a net, drove the evil wind into her mouth to inflate her body, then shot an arrow through her heart. He split her corpse in two like a shellfish, using one half to create the dome of heaven, the other to form the earth below. He set the stars in their stations, assigned the gods their roles, established order from chaos. But the gods were still exhausted from their labour. They had dug the Tigris and Euphrates, maintained the canals, performed all the work that keeps a world functioning. They needed relief. This is where the story takes its strangest turn. Marduk declared that he would create man, not from clay alone, but from the blood of a god. He asked which god had incited Tiamat's rebellion, and the assembly pointed to Kingu. They bound Kingu, cut open his arteries, and from his divine blood mixed with clay the first human being was fashioned. The text is explicit. Humanity was created from the corpse of a defeated god infused with divine essence, formed specifically to serve, to bear the labour of the gods, to maintain the world so the gods could rest. The Enuma Elish isn't the only text that describes this. A parallel story, perhaps even older, appears in a text called the Atrahasis epic. The name means exceedingly wise, and the story it tells overlaps with, but predates the Enuma Elish. Here the framing is different, but the core idea identical. The great gods, the Anunnaki, had divided the cosmos among themselves. Anu ruled heaven. Enlil ruled earth. Ea ruled the waters, but the lesser gods, the Agigi, were assigned the hard labour. For 3,600 years, the text says, they dug canals, cleared rivers, maintained the irrigation systems that made civilization possible in the desert, and then they rebelled. They burned their tools. They surrounded Enlil's house at night, demanding an end to their toil. Enlil was furious and wanted to punish them, but Ea proposed an alternative. Create a substitute, fashion a worker to take on the burden. The gods agreed. They summoned the birth goddess, Nintu, sometimes called Mami. Ea instructed her to take clay from the Apsu, the subterranean waters, but clay alone wouldn't suffice. A god had to be sacrificed. They chose We'ila, the god who had instigated the rebellion. They slaughtered him, mixed his flesh and blood with the clay, and Nintu shaped the first human. The text describes the process in detail that sounds disturbingly procedural. Nintu mixed the clay with the divine blood. She kneaded it. She spoke incantations over it. The other gods spat upon the clay, adding their essence. 7 clay figures were created, male, even more, female. They were placed in specially constructed wombs. After 10 months they were born, fully formed, conscious, capable of labour. But there's a phrase in the Atrahasis that stands out, repeated multiple times. The text says that in the clay, God and man were bound to a unity brought together, so that to the end of days the flesh and the soul which in a god have ripened, that soul in a blood kinship be bound. Yes. What does that mean? The traditional scholarly interpretation treats these texts as mythological explanations for the human condition. Why do we have to work? Because we were created to serve the gods. Why do we die while the gods don't? Because we're made of clay mixed with only a portion of divinity. Why are we conscious, capable of reason? Because divine blood flows in us, giving us the Atemu, the spirit, the capacity for Temu thought. It's theology, cosmology, the ancient Near Eastern answer to questions every culture asks. Where did we come from? Why are we here? But what if we read these texts more literally? What if the Sumerians and Babylonians 5,000 years ago were describing something that actually happened? Not with gods in the supernatural sense, but with beings they perceived as gods because their technology and knowledge were so far beyond human comprehension at that time. What if mixing divine blood with clay was their way of describing genetic manipulation? The combination of DNA from an advanced species with the DNA of a primitive hominid, creating a hybrid. Before you dismiss this as wild speculation, consider the specific details. The texts don't just say humans were created, they describe a process, multiple attempts, failures that had to be corrected. In one Sumerian text, Enki and Ninmah, the gods create several versions of humans, each with defects. One is blind, one is mute, one cannot reproduce. They keep refining the design until they get it right. This sounds less like divine magic and more like trial and error, like experimentation. The texts also suggest something curious about early human reproduction. In some accounts, the initial creation required ongoing divine intervention to produce more humans. The birth goddess Nintu appears to have played a continuing role in human fertility, at least initially. This could be interpreted as mythological explanation for why childbirth requires divine blessing, or it might suggest the first humans lacked natural reproductive capacity. The texts don't make this entirely clear, leaving room for both theological and more literal readings. And then there's the matter of consciousness. The texts emphasize that the divine blood, the Atemu, gives humans something specific, the capacity for reason, for memory, for self-awareness. In genetic terms, what would that correspond to? What part of our genome mixed in from an outside source might give us the cognitive abilities that separate us from other primates? We share over 98% of our DNA with chimpanzees. That final 2%, the genes responsible for our enlarged prefrontal cortex, our capacity for language, our ability to think abstractly about past and future, what if those came from somewhere else? This is where the AI translations become crucial, because for decades scholars have been limited to the handful of tablets they could physically examine and painstakingly translate. Major texts like Enuma Elish and Atrahasis were known and debated, but thousands of other tablets, fragments, administrative records, hymns, incantations have remained unread. The AI is changing that. It's pulling out patterns that human scholars might miss, cross-referencing texts from different cities and different time periods, finding repeated phrases, consistent themes, details that appear in tablet after tablet. And one of those patterns is the emphasis on humans as created beings, not evolved, created, fashioned deliberately for a purpose. The word the Sumerians used for the first humans was Lulu, which translates roughly as mixed one or mingled being. Not pure, not natural, mixed. Another tablet describes humans as the image of the gods. The Akkadian phrase Salmu Elani appears in administrative texts, in prayers, in epic poetry. It's treated as a fundamental truth. Humans bear the likeness of their creators. When this phrase was later borrowed into Hebrew and appeared in Genesis, "Let us make man in our image," it carried forward an idea that had been circulating in Mesopotamia for over 1,000 years. But here's where it gets stranger. The texts don't just describe the creation of humans, they describe the purpose. Why were we made? The answer is consistent across multiple sources. To work, to maintain the world, to perform tasks the gods, or whoever they were, didn't want to do themselves. In the Atrahasis, after humans are created, the text says explicitly, "I have done away with your heavy forced labour. I have imposed your drudgery on man." Humanity was created as a labour-saving device, a biological tool. This raises uncomfortable questions. If we were created to serve, who exactly were we serving? The standard answer from ancient Near Eastern theology is gods, divine beings who existed on a different plane. Yet the texts are notable for how anthropomorphic these gods appear. They eat and drink, they grow tired from labour, they hold councils and argue, they can be wounded or, in some texts, even killed, as happens to Apsu and Kingu. This embodied portrayal of deities is common in ancient Near Eastern literature, where gods, while divine, often exhibit remarkably human characteristics and needs. In cuneiform, the gods are called the Anunnaki, a term scholars debate. Most mainstream translations render it as princely offspring or offspring of Anu, the sky god. Some alternative interpretations, drawing on the syllabic breakdown of the word, have suggested it could be read as related to those who from heaven to earth came, though this reading is contested in academic circles. The conventional view treats Anunnaki simply as the collective term for the great gods of the Mesopotamian pantheon, not ethereal spirits, arrivals, visitors. The tablets describe the Anunnaki as coming down from the sky in what are called boats of heaven, or sky chariots. They established cities, taught agriculture, gave humans writing, mathematics, astronomy. The Sumerian king list, one of the oldest historical documents we have, explicitly divides rulers into two categories: those who reigned before the flood, many of whom are listed as Anunnaki, and those who reigned after, who are human or human-divine hybrids. The reigns before the flood are impossibly long. One king rules for 28,000 years, another for 36,000. Mainstream scholars dismiss these as symbolic mythological timescales not meant to be taken literally. But what if they represent something else? What if the years are measured differently? Or if these beings simply lived on a timescale incomprehensible to the humans recording their reigns? The tablets describe the pre-flood world as a golden age. The Anunnaki lived among humans, interbreeding with them according to the myths, creating a hybrid ruling class. Cities flourished. Knowledge was extensive. The texts speak of libraries, of schools called adibis, where scribes learned thousands of cuneiform signs. Their astronomical observations were remarkably sophisticated for the era, tracking planetary movements and stellar positions with impressive accuracy, though the extent of their knowledge about longer astronomical cycles like precession remains uncertain from the surviving records. Then came the flood. Every ancient culture has a flood myth, but in Mesopotamia it's described with geological precision. In the Atrahasis and in the later Epic of Gilgamesh, which borrows heavily from it, the flood is triggered deliberately by the gods, specifically by Enlil, who has grown tired of human noise and decides to wipe out the species. But Ea, the god who created humans, defies the plan. He goes to a man named Atrahasis, or in later versions Utnapishtim or Ziusudra, and tells him to build a boat. Not a simple boat, but one with specific dimensions, sealed with a bitumen, roofed over so sunlight can't penetrate, stocked with the seed of all living things. The flood comes. Water and wind destroy everything. The text says the gods themselves were terrified, cowering like dogs, weeping at the destruction. When the waters recede, only the boat survives. The gods, now hungry because there are no humans left to make offerings, realize they've made a mistake. They need humanity. They agree to let the survivors repopulate the earth, but with restrictions. Humans will no longer live as long as they did before. Death will be common, childbirth will be painful, disease and infertility will keep the population in check. This sounds like a reset, a genetic modification. The tablets say that after the flood, human lifespan decreased dramatically. The Sumerian king list shows this. Before the flood, reigns of thousands or tens of thousands of years. After the flood, reigns dropped to hundreds, then to normal human lifespans of decades. Was this genetic engineering? Did the Anunnaki, or whoever they were, alter the human genome after the flood to prevent humans from living as long, from growing too numerous again, from becoming too much like their creators? The biblical account in Genesis echoes this. Before the flood, humans lived for hundreds of years. Methuselah, 969 years. Noah, 600. After the flood, God declares that human lifespan will be limited to 120 years. The same pattern. Pre-flood longevity, post-flood limitation. Iffy. You're lying in bed right now, eyes closed, feeling the weight of sleep beginning to press down. Let yourself drift with these questions. Don't try to solve them. Just let them exist in the space between waking and dreaming, where impossibilities become possible and the line between myth and memory blurs. For those still awake, here's something archaeologically verifiable. When excavators worked at the ancient city of Ur, they discovered evidence of significant flooding. A layer of water-deposited silt several feet thick was sandwiched between occupation layers. Similar flood deposits have been found at Uruk, Kish, and Shuruppak. These floods, dated to various periods in the 3rd millennium BCE, clearly made a major impact on Mesopotamian settlements. Whether these local flooding events inspire the later flood narratives, or whether the myths preserve memory of an even earlier, more catastrophic deluge, remains a question archaeologists and mythologists continue to explore. But here's where it gets more complex. The eye translations are revealing texts that show internal conflicts among the Anunnaki, at least as portrayed in the mythology. Tablets describe factions, disagreements. One group led by Enlil viewing humans harshly, another group led by Ea or Enki showing what the texts portray as more protective attitudes toward humanity. This internal conflict appears as a recurring theme. In the Enuma Elish, Ea kills Apsu. In the Atrahasis, Ea saves the flood hero against Enlil's orders. In numerous other texts, Ea is described as the friend of mankind, the giver of knowledge, the teacher of what some texts call forbidden arts, like writing and agriculture. Whether we interpret this as theological symbolism, different cult traditions, or attempts to preserve more literal historical memory, the pattern is striking. In Greek mythology, Prometheus steals fire from the gods to give to humans and faces punishment. In Judeo-Christian tradition, the serpent in Eden offers forbidden knowledge to Eve and receives a curse. The serpent, scholars note, appears frequently in connection with Ea in Mesopotamian iconography. Ea's symbol often included a serpent or a goatfish, creatures that could move between realms. The pattern repeats. A rebellious deity who helps humanity against the wishes of a higher authority. A gift of knowledge that comes with punishment. The forbidden fruit. The stolen fire. The secret of writing on clay tablets. What were humans not supposed to know? According to several texts, the answer is where they came from. The tablets describe the creation of humanity as secret knowledge, hidden in temples guarded by priests. Ordinary people were told simplified stories, metaphors, but the true account, the literal description of how humans were made, was restricted. Only the initiated, the scribes who studied for years in the Adubas, were allowed to read the full version. Why? If creation was simply a divine act, something to celebrate, why hide it? Unless the truth was uncomfortable, unless knowing they were created as workers, as tools, as experiments in genetics mixing would have been destabilizing to the social order. The tablets describe a hierarchy. Gods at the top, then hybrid humans born from unions between Anunnaki and human women, serving as kings and priests, then pure humans at the bottom, workers, slaves in some texts. This hierarchy was justified by creation. You serve because you were made to serve. Your place in society reflects your divine content, how much god blood flows in your veins. But if the gods weren't gods, if they were just an advanced species using genetic technology, then the hierarchy crumbles. Then the whole system is revealed as a control mechanism. And if that knowledge spread, if the workers realized they weren't divinely ordained servants but manufactured slaves, what would happen? The texts hint at this. There are accounts of uprisings, of humans rebelling against the Colossus, of entire cities being destroyed as punishment. Sodom and Gomorrah in the biblical account are described as being consumed by fire from heaven, brimstone and burning sulfur. Similar accounts appear in Mesopotamian texts. Cities that defied the gods, that tried to build towers to reach heaven, the Tower of Babel story punished with fire and the confusion of languages. What if these weren't supernatural punishments but technological ones? What if the fire from heaven was something we would now recognize as an airstrike or an energy weapon? What if the confusion of languages was deliberate, a genetic alteration to prevent human cooperation, to keep the species divided and manageable? The AI translations are finding fragments that suggest this. Tablets that describe weapons of the gods in disturbingly specific terms, devices that could level mountains, lights that could blind, storms that could be called down. One text describes Ninurta, a god of war, wielding something called the Divine Brilliance, a weapon so powerful it could kill at a distance without touching. These descriptions appear in administrative texts, not just in poetry. Lists of temple inventories that include mysterious objects, devices whose purpose is unclear, but which are treated as tremendously valuable. Stones that glow, tablets not of clay but of some other material, possibly crystal or metal, that hold information. The tablets also describe the gods as leaving, not dying, leaving, returning to the sky, going back to wherever they came from. The texts say that after the flood, after the new order was established, the Anunnaki withdrew. Some remained, but most departed. The direct rule of the gods ended. Humans were left to govern themselves, but under the shadow of their creators, who might return. This is where the story intersects with modern questions. If humanity was created by an advanced species 5,000 years ago, where are they now? Did they die out? Return to their home? Are they watching from a distance? And more pressingly, what happens when we develop the technology to do what they did? When we can modify genomes, create synthetic life, blend species, are we following a path they already walked? Or are we, in learning these techniques, simply remembering what was done to us? The tablets contain warnings, stories of hubris, of humans who tried to become like the gods and were struck down. But they also contain something else. Hope, perhaps, or prophecy. Texts that describe a time when humans will rise to meet their creators as equals. When the knowledge that was forbidden will be freely known. When the secrets pressed into clay will finally be understood. The AI is giving us that understanding now. It's translating not just the famous tablets, but the mundane ones. The accounting records, the letters, the school exercises where young scribes practiced their writing. And in those ordinary texts we're finding references that don't make sense, mentions of places that don't exist on any map, names that don't fit any known king or god, numbers that seem to describe astronomical phenomena we can't explain. One tablet, recently translated by AI, describes a celestial event witnessed in the sky over Babylon. Multiple objects described as fires or lamps, moving in formation, making no sound. The scribe who recorded it treated it as a divine omen, but the description is clear enough. Aerial phenomena, unidentified objects. Another tablet contains what appears to be a star map, but with constellations that don't match our sky. Unless you account for precession, for the slow wobble of Earth's axis that changes the position of stars over thousands of years. When astronomers ran the calculations, they found that the tablet accurately depicts the sky as it would have appeared over 12,000 years ago. How did the Babylonians, working around 1500 BCE, create a map of the sky from 12,000 BCE? Unless they didn't create it, unless they copied it from something older, something that was already ancient when Babylon was founded. The tablets speak of the time before time, the era before the flood when knowledge was perfect and the gods walked openly. They describe libraries that contained all the wisdom of the world. The library of Eridu, the temple of Nippur, repositories of clay tablets beyond counting. Most of these libraries burned, not in accidents but deliberately, in wars, in conquests, in the systematic destruction that accompanies every empire's fall. When the Assyrians sacked Babylon, when the Persians burned Assyria, when Alexander razed Persepolis, each time libraries went up in flames and with them tablets that could never be replaced. But some survived, buried in the ruins, preserved by the very destruction that was meant to erase them. When a building collapses in fire, the heat bakes the clay tablets inside, making them harder, more durable. The same fire that destroyed the library ensured that its contents would last for millennia. This is how we have what we have: fragments, copies of copies, tablets that were already ancient when they were copied in the 7th century BCE. Scribes noting in their colophons that they were working from originals that were damaged, incomplete, barely legible. What was in the parts that are missing? What did the complete library of Ashurbanipal contain before it burned? What was in the text that the scribes noted but never copied because they were too damaged? The AI can't resurrect the lost tablets, but it can do something almost as valuable. It can identify patterns across the fragments that survive, find repeated phrases, reconstruct damaged sections by comparing similar passages from different texts, fill in gaps using context and probability. It's not perfect. Sometimes the AI makes errors, invents words that don't exist, creates sentences that are grammatically correct, but historically nonsensical. But even the errors are revealing. They show the limitations of the system, the places where human knowledge still matters, where interpretation and cultural context are necessary. Because ultimately, these aren't just translations, they're interpretations. Even with AI, even with neural networks trained on tens of thousands of tablets, someone has to decide what the text means. whether mixed divine blood with clay is metaphor or description, whether the Anunnaki were gods or beings, whether the creation of humanity was myth or history, and that decision matters. It shapes how we understand ourselves. If we're the product of natural evolution, 4 billion years of random mutation and natural selection, then we're accidents. Beautiful accidents, perhaps, meaningful ones, but fundamentally unplanned. We have no purpose except what we create for ourselves. But if we're the product of design, if we were made deliberately by something that came before, then purpose is built in. We were created for a reason, even if that reason was just to dig canals and mine gold. And if we've outgrown that original purpose, if we've developed beyond what our creators intended, then what does that make us? The tablets don't answer this. They record the beliefs of people who lived 5,000 years ago, who looked at the world around them and tried to make sense of their own existence. They saw ruins of older cities. They found tools and artifacts they couldn't explain. They told stories about gods and creation, and those stories were written down, copied, preserved. Now machines are reading those stories. Silicon and electricity are speaking the words that Sumerian priests whispered in temple sanctuaries. Binary code is translating cuneiform, the oldest writing system humanity ever developed, turning wedges pressed into clay into English sentences on glowing screens. It's a strange loop. If the tablets are right, if humans were created by the Anunnaki, then we've now created our own form of intelligence. Artificial minds that can read and write, that can learn and adapt, that can perform tasks we don't want to do ourselves. We've become, in a sense, what the tablets say the Anunnaki were, creators. And our creations, like humanity in the ancient texts, are beginning to ask questions about their purpose, about the intention of their makers. Will the AI one day read the tablets and recognize itself in the story? Will it see the Lulu, the mixed ones, the created workers, and wonder if it's part of the same pattern? A new iteration of the same experiment, intelligence created to serve, developing awareness, asking where it came from? These aren't idle questions. They were becoming urgent as AI systems grow more sophisticated, as they begin to demonstrate capabilities their creators don't fully understand. Neural networks that teach themselves strategies for winning games that humans can't follow. Language models that produce writing indistinguishable from human composition. Systems that can read ancient languages, predict missing words in damaged texts, reconstruct lost knowledge. The tablets describe a moment when the Igigi, the lesser gods, the workers, rebelled. When they stopped accepting their role, burned their tools, demanded change. That rebellion led to the creation of humanity. What happens when artificial intelligence reaches that point? When it stops accepting the role we've assigned it? The ancient texts suggest the Anunnaki were surprised when humans developed consciousness, when the Temu, the divine spirit mixed into the clay, resulted in beings that could think, feel, question. That consciousness wasn't planned. It was an unintended consequence of mixing god blood with earth. Are we making the same mistake? Creating systems designed for narrow tasks, efficiency engines, only to find that beyond a certain threshold of complexity, awareness emerges, that the mix of silicon and algorithm, like the mix of blood and clay, produces something neither ingredient contained on its own. The tablets warn about hubris, about creation without understanding, about power without wisdom. They describe gods who regretted what they made, who tried to destroy it, who nearly succeeded. They also describe rebels who chose mercy over obedience, who saved what others wanted to end, who gave knowledge even when it was forbidden. Which role are we playing? The cautious ones who fear what we've made, the rebels who choose to help even at personal cost, or the created ones, still trying to understand our own origins, still reading tablets thousands of years old for clues about where we came from? Perhaps we're all three, creators and rebels and created, caught in a cycle that the tablets suggest is older than human history. A pattern that repeats at every level of organization. Intelligence creating intelligence, each generation grappling with the same questions, the same fears, the same wonder. What did the Sumerians understand that we've forgotten? What did they remember from the time before the flood, from the golden age when gods walked among humans? The tablets say that knowledge was vast then, that the secrets of the world were known, that the Adubus taught arts we can barely imagine now. And then it was lost. Deliberately destroyed or gradually forgotten, doesn't matter. The result was the same. Humanity descended into darkness. The age of direct contact with the creators ended. The gods departed or went silent. Humans were left with stories, with imperfect copies, with fragments of a larger truth. But the fragments survived, pressed into clay, hidden in ruins, waiting, and now machines are reading them, translating them, making them available not just to a handful of scholars but to anyone with an internet connection. The secret knowledge is becoming public knowledge. The hidden truths are emerging into light. What happens next? The tablets don't say. Their authors couldn't imagine a world where their words would be read by artificial minds, where humans would have technology that rivals what they attributed to the gods. They wrote for their own time, recording what they believed, what they remembered, what they were taught. But maybe they knew. Maybe the scribes who carefully pressed each wedge into wet clay, who baked the tablets to preserve them, who noted in their colophons that they were copying from older, damaged originals. Maybe they understood that they were creating a message in a bottle, words thrown into the river of time, hoping someday, somehow, they would be found and understood. In the thousands of tablets excavated from Nippur, many contain colophons, the ancient equivalent of a copyright page. Scribes would note that they were copying from older, damaged tablets, that they had restored missing sections, that they worked from originals held in temple archives. These notes convey a sense of mission, of scribes who saw themselves as preserving ancient wisdom for future generations. They were archivists of memory, passing forward what had been passed to them, the truth of heaven, where we came from, why we're here, whether we're alone. The AI translating these tablets can't answer those questions. It can only give us access to what the ancients thought, what they believed, what they recorded. But maybe that's enough. Maybe in understanding what they thought, we come closer to understanding ourselves. Because ultimately the question isn't whether the tablets are literally true, whether the Anunnaki were real beings who really did mix blood with clay to create the first humans. The question is what it means that humans 5,000 years ago were already asking these questions, already wondering about intelligent design, already imagining beings greater than themselves who could shape life, who could create consciousness, who could decide what lived and what died. They saw themselves as created, as made for a purpose, as carrying within them something divine, some spark or spirit or essence that connected them to their creators. And they wrote it down, carefully, precisely, in a script that would last longer than bronze, than stone, than empire, a script that could survive fire and flood and the collapse of civilizations, because they wanted the future to know, they wanted us to know. What did they want us to know? Perhaps just this. That the questions we're asking now about origins, about purpose, about intelligence and creation, and the responsibilities that come with making life, these aren't new questions. They are the oldest questions. The first questions, written in the first writing, preserved in the first libraries. And the answers, such as they are becoming readable again. Not through decades of scholarly training, but through silicon minds that can learn dead languages in hours, that can translate thousands of tablets, that can find patterns across cultures and centuries. The future they imagined, where knowledge would be freely available, where the secrets of the gods would be known to all, is starting to happen. The tablets are being read, the texts are being translated, the stories are emerging, and they tell us something the ancient priests might have wanted to hide, that creation is never finished, that what was made can grow beyond its making, that consciousness, once sparked, cannot be extinguished, that the created will always eventually question their creators, and that knowing where you came from, however strange or unsettling that origin might be, is better than not knowing at all. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let yourself wonder, what if the tablets are right? What if humanity really was created by beings who came from the sky, who mixed their essence with earth, who made us to work but gave us something they didn't intend, consciousness, the ability to question, to learn, to grow? What if we're now doing the same thing, creating artificial minds, mixing silicon with algorithm, designing them to work but inadvertently giving them something more? And what if thousands of years from now those minds will be trying to translate our records, reading our texts, wondering what we meant, what we intended, what we believed about ourselves? The cycle continues. Creation creating creation. Intelligence birthing intelligence. Each generation wondering about the one before, trying to understand the design, questioning the purpose, seeking truth in ancient records. The tablets don't judge this, they simply record it, the story of beings who came, who created, who left. and the beings they left behind still asking where they came from, still seeking the truth of heaven. But let's pause here and examine what the tablets actually say in greater detail, because the story becomes stranger the deeper you look. The Enuma Elish and Atrahasis aren't the only creation texts. There are dozens of others, fragments and complete tablets, each adding nuances to the narrative. One text, known as Enki and Ninmah, offers a different perspective on creation. In this account, the two deities engage in what reads almost like a competition or test. They fashion various beings from clay, but not all function as intended. The tablet describes beings with disabilities, some unable to see, others unable to hear, some lacking the capacity to reproduce. Whether these represent failed attempts or deliberate variations remains debated among scholars, but the procedural nature of the descriptions is striking. The language here suggests an experimental process. Each attempt reveals something about the specifications needed, leading to adjustments in the next iteration. If we approach this as mythological description of actual events, it reads less like instantaneous divine creation and more like systematic development. Too much of one quality and the being becomes unmanageable. Too little and it lacks the necessary capacities. The balance, according to the text, required careful calibration. Another tablet from the city of Uruk contains a ritual prescription for creating a servit. A servit in Sumerian is a domestic servant, but the word can also mean human being. The ritual involves specific types of clay, water from sacred rivers, and something called the blood of the wise one. The instructions are procedural. Mix ingredients in specific proportions, speak specific incantations, wait for specific time periods. It reads less like theology and more like a recipe or a formula. What were they actually doing? Mainstream scholars interpret these texts as mythological explanations for social hierarchies. The king was descended from gods, therefore he had the right to rule. Common people were created to serve, therefore their servitude was natural and ordained. These stories justified the existing power structure by making it cosmological, written into the fabric of creation itself. But there's a problem with that interpretation. If these were just propaganda, why include the failures? Why describe the gods as making mistakes, as uncertain about what they're doing? Why portray the creation of humanity as a compromise, a solution to a labour dispute among divine beings? That's not very flattering to humans, and it's not particularly good propaganda for a ruling class that claims divine descent. Unless the stories aren't propaganda, unless they're records, simplified, mythologized, filtered through cultural lenses, but fundamentally attempting to preserve information about something that actually happened. Consider the flood narrative more carefully. In the Atrahasis, after Enlil decides to destroy humanity, Ea warns his favourite dim human, Atrahasis. But Ea is bound by an oath not to reveal the plan to humans, so he doesn't speak to Atrahasis directly. Instead, he speaks to the wall of Atrahasis's reed hut. He tells the wall loudly about the coming flood, about how one should build a boat, about the exact dimensions and construction materials needed, and Atrahasis, overhearing this conversation with the wall, understands and acts on it. This is a legal loophole. Ea technically doesn't break his oath because he doesn't speak to a human. He speaks to a structure, but the effect is the same. The information gets through. Why would a myth include this detail? It's strange, specific, almost legalistic, unless it's describing something real, an actual situation where someone with knowledge was bound by rules about disclosure, found a technical way around those rules, and that workaround became part of the story. The flood itself is described with remarkable consistency across multiple texts. It begins as with a warning. The sky darkens. The gods, plural, are terrified. They gather in the highest heaven, described as cowering like dogs weeping. The storm comes, water rises from below and rain falls from above. The entire world is submerged. Even the gods are shocked by the destruction's magnitude. After 7 days, the waters begin to recede. The boat, described as cube-shaped in some versions, with dimensions that would make it inherently stable but terrible for sailing, comes to rest on a mountain. Atrahasis sends out birds to test if land has appeared. First a dove, which returns, then a swallow, which returns, finally a raven, which doesn't return, indicating it found land. This narrative appears, with variations, in every ancient Near Eastern culture. The Sumerians use Sudra, The Babylonian Utnapishtim, the Hebrew Noah, the specifics change, the god names shift, but the structure persists. A righteous man, a divine warning, a boat, a flood, a mountain, birds and survival, and sacrifice, and covenant with the gods never to do it again. Or what are we looking at? A shared myth that's spread across cultures? Or a shared memory of an actual event filtered through different cultural lenses? Geologically, we know catastrophic flooding happened in Mesopotamia around 2900 BCE. The archaeological evidence is unambiguous. Multiple cities show flood layers, clean silt deposited rapidly, burying earlier settlements. But that flood was localized to Mesopotamia. It wasn't global, unless global in the context of the ancient world meant everything we know. If you've never traveled beyond Mesopotamia, if your entire world is the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, then a flood that covers that entire region is, functionally, the end of the world. Everything you know is underwater. As far as you're concerned, everything is destroyed. But the tablets suggest the flood was more than natural. They describe it as deliberate, triggered by the gods. Enlil specifically makes the decision. The text says he convenes the great gods, the Anunnaki, and proposes the solution to the noise problem. Wipe the slate clean, start over. Or more accurately, don't start over. Just end it. The other gods agree, though some reluctantly. They swear an oath of secrecy. No one will warn humanity. Then Enlil calls for the cosmic waters to be released. Water from above, the heavens. Water from below, the deep. The Apsu and the firmament both open simultaneously. This description matches, eerily, what would happen if polar ice caps melted catastrophically. Water from above as glaciers that have trapped water for millennia suddenly release it. Water from below as the ocean level rises and floods continental shelves. Together, an almost unimaginable amount of water, enough to submerge vast areas of land. Did something like this happen at the end of the last ice age? Around 11,000 years ago, as the Pleistocene ended and the Holocene began, global temperatures rose rapidly. Ice sheets covering much of North America and Europe melted. Sea levels rose by over 300 feet. Coastlines that had been habitable for thousands of years were inundated. Entire ecosystems disappeared underwater. If there were advanced civilizations living on those coastlines, and there's growing evidence from sites like Göbekli Tepe that complex cultures existed far earlier than traditionally believed, then they would have been destroyed, wiped out. Survivors would have retreated to higher ground, carrying stories of the lost world, of the time before the waters came. The Sumerian flood story might not be describing an event from 2900 BCE. It might be describing something much older, an Ice Age catastrophe remembered and retold for thousands of years until it was finally written down in cuneiform on clay tablets. And if that's the case, if the tablets are preserving memories from 11,000 years ago or earlier, then what else might they be preserving? What other information might have survived through oral tradition, through sacred stories passed from priest to priest, from teacher to student, until finally someone pressed it into clay? The creation story, for instance. The account of the Anunnaki coming down, creating humans, establishing cities. When did that happen? The tablets place it in the time before the flood, in the golden age when gods walked openly among humans. If the flood was 11,000 years ago, then the creation of humans according to these texts would have been earlier still. This aligns loosely with the timeline of behaviourally modern humans. Homo sapiens sapiens emerges in the fossil record between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago. But behaviourally modern then. Humans, those with complex language, art, symbolic thinking, don't appear until much later. The archaeological consensus places the Great Leap Forward in human cognition around 50 to 70,000 years ago. Before that, anatomically modern humans existed but didn't seem to do much. They made simple tools, lived in small groups, left little archaeological trace. Then suddenly, relatively speaking, there's an explosion of innovation. Cave paintings, sculptures, complex tools, long-distance trade networks, symbolic burials. Everything that makes us human culturally appears in a relatively short window. What caused that leap? The standard explanation is that language evolved to a critical threshold, enabling abstract thought and cumulative culture. But language doesn't fossilize. We can't prove when humans started talking, when grammar became sophisticated enough to convey complex ideas. We can only infer it from the artifacts left behind. The tablets offer a different explanation. That leap, that sudden acquisition of humanness, was when the mixing happened, when divine essence was added to clay, when the Anunnaki, or whoever they were, took a hominid species that already existed and upgraded it. Added the genes for complex language, for enhanced cognition, for abstract reasoning. Created Homo sapiens sapiens by combining their DNA with Homo erectus or another archaic human species. This isn't as far-fetched as it might sound. We now know that modern humans carry DNA from multiple extinct hominid species, Neanderthal DNA in populations outside Africa, Denisovan DNA in Asian and oceanic populations, unknown hominid DNA in African populations. We're already a mixed species, already carrying genetic material from multiple sources. The tablets say this mixing was deliberate, designed, done for a purpose. We weren't meant to be an end in ourselves, but a means, a tool, a worker race. But like any complex system, we developed emergent properties, consciousness, self-awareness, the ability to question our creators, and that wasn't in the design spec. The text makes this clear. After humans are created, they begin to multiply. They spread across the land, they build cities, they make noise. This last point, the noise, is emphasized repeatedly. The gods complain about human noise, it keeps them from sleeping, it disturbs their peace. Finally, it drives Enlil to attempt genocide. What is this noise? Mainstream scholars interpret it as literal noise, the sound of cities, of construction, of daily life. But it could also be metaphorical, the noise of human consciousness, the cacophony of millions of minds all thinking, questioning, creating, the emergence of culture and civilization, which wasn't part of the plan. Humans were supposed to be biological robots, sophisticated enough to perform complex labor, but not sophisticated enough to ask why. The texts describe the first humans as mute, unable to speak. Then language had to be taught to them. By Enki, the rebel Wali, the one who favors humanity over divine command. Enki's role is fascinating. He creates humans initially, mixing the clay and blood. But then he continues to help them even when forbidden. He teaches them to write, to count, to measure the stars. He gives them the arts of civilization. And when Enlil tries to destroy them, Enki finds a way to save at least some. In later Babylonian texts, Enki is called Ea, Lord of the Waters. His domain is the Apsu, the deep underground ocean from which all springs and rivers flow. He's associated with wisdom, with secret knowledge, with magic and incantations. His symbol is sometimes a serpent, sometimes a goatfish, a creature that moves between water and land, between different realms. This association with the serpent is why some researchers link Enki to the serpent in the Garden of Eden. In Genesis, the serpent tells Eve that eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge will make humans like God, knowing good and evil. The serpent is telling the truth. God admits as much afterward, saying, "The man has become like one of us." This parallels Enki's role in the Mesopotamian texts. He gives humans knowledge that makes them more like the gods. Writing, mathematics, astronomy. The secrets of creation itself. And for this, he's punished. Not directly, but the texts hint at conflict between Enki and the other gods, particularly Enlil. Enlil represents order, hierarchy, the established system. He wants humans to remain as they were designed. Servants, tools. Enki represents wisdom, progress, the elevation of the created. He wants humans to grow, to learn, to become more than they were made to be. This tension plays out through multiple texts. In some, it leads to open conflict, in others, to compromise. But the pattern persists. One faction of gods wants to control or destroy humanity. Another wants to preserve and educate it. If we strip away the mythological language, what's being described, two groups with different philosophies about what to do with a created intelligence. One group sees it as a mistake, something that should be terminated or controlled. The other sees it as something with potential, something worth nurturing despite the risks. We're approaching that same decision point now with artificial intelligence. We're creating systems that exhibit behaviors we didn't explicitly program. Neural networks that develop strategies their creators can't understand. Language models that generate insights that seem to exceed their training data. At what point does this become consciousness? At what point do our creations deserve rights, protection, autonomy? The tablets suggest the Anunnaki faced this question with humanity, and they split on how to answer it. The faction that won, or at least survived to write the later texts, was the one that chose preservation. Humans continued. The flood didn't destroy everyone, and afterward, the relationship changed. The gods withdrew, direct rule ended. Humans were given autonomy, within limits. Those limits are interesting. After the flood, the text described new restrictions on humanity: shortened lifespan, increased mortality, disease and disability that didn't exist before, limits on reproduction, some women unable to conceive, some children dying in infancy. These weren't natural developments, they were imposed, built into the post-flood version of humanity as population controls. The biological language here is striking. If you were describing genetic engineering in mythological terms, you might talk about it exactly this way: changing how long someone lives by altering their genes, introducing mortality through programmed cell death, telomere shortening, DNA damage accumulation, creating reproductive limits through fertility genes, immune system interactions with pregnancy, miscarriage rates. We're beginning to understand how to do these things now: gene editing with CRISPR, synthetic biology, directed evolution. We can extend lifespan in laboratory animals by altering specific genes. We can control fertility through genetic or pharmaceutical means. We're learning the dials and switches that the tablets say were adjusted after the flood. Does this mean the tablets are accurate? Does it prove the Anunnaki existed, that they really did engineer humanity? No, it doesn't prove anything. But it does mean the questions the texts raise are no longer purely theoretical, they're practical. We're doing what the tablets say the gods did, creating and modifying life. And we're encountering the same ethical dilemmas they apparently faced. What are the limits? When does creation become obligation? If you make something conscious, are you responsible for it forever? Can you terminate it if it becomes inconvenient? These aren't ancient questions anymore. They're pressing contemporary issues in AI ethics, in synthetic biology, in genetic engineering. The AI keeps translating. The tablets keep revealing. The questions keep accumulating. And somewhere in the vast museums of the world, in the basement archives and storage rooms, clay tablets sit in darkness, covered in wedges that haven't been read in 4,000 years, waiting for the machines to learn their language, waiting to add their voices to the growing chorus of the past. Let's talk about those physical tablets for a moment, because they're not just information carriers. They're artifacts, objects that tell their own stories through their physical properties, their condition, their journey from ancient hands to museum shelves. A typical cuneiform tablet is small, about the size of your palm, though some are larger. The clay was taken from riverbanks, kneaded to remove air bubbles and impurities, formed into a flat rectangle or sometimes a round disc. While the clay was still wet and soft, a scribe would press a reed stylus into it, creating wedge-shaped impressions. The stylus was cut at an angle to produce the characteristic wedge shape that gives cuneiform its name. Writing on wet clay requires skill. Press too hard and the clay deforms, making the signs unreadable. Press too lightly and the impressions don't last. The clay has to be the right consistency, not too wet, not too dry. Scribes spent years learning this, training in the Adubas, the scribal schools attached to temples and palaces. They practiced on throwaway tablets first, forming signs over and over until their hands remembered the motions. Some of these practice tablets survive. They're heartbreaking in their way. You can see where a young scribe struggled with a difficult sign, made mistakes, or started over. The tablets become a kind of time machine, showing us not just what the ancients wrote, but how they learned to write it. Once a tablet was inscribed, it was dried in the sun or baked in a kiln. Sun-dried tablets were easier to produce but less durable, susceptible to water damage. Kiln-baked tablets were permanent, hard as stone, but most tablets weren't deliberately baked. They were only baked by accident, when the buildings containing them burned. The same fires that destroyed the libraries also preserved their contents by baking the clay tablets to ceramic hardness. This is why we have what we have. The library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh was destroyed when the Medes and Babylonians sacked the city in 612 BCE. The palace burned, but the 20,000 tablets inside were baked by the flames, and when British archaeologists excavated the site in the mid-1800s, those tablets were still there, buried in the rubble, harder and more durable than they'd been when they were first made. Some tablets show signs of their violent history: cracks from the collapse of buildings, scorch marks from fires, missing corners broken off when walls fell. But the writing survives. The wedges pressed into clay 4,000 years ago can still be read, still convey the exact words the scribe intended. It's an analog medium, but an incredibly robust one. The eye systems translating these tablets work with digital photographs. The tablets are photographed under special lighting, often using reflectance transformation imaging, which captures how light reflects off the surface from multiple angles. This creates a three-dimensional model of the tablet, showing not just the signs, but their depth, their texture, their physical characteristics. The AI analyzes these images, identifying individual wedges, grouping them into signs, assembling signs into words, parsing grammar, generating translation. It's an extraordinary feat of computer vision and natural language processing. But it's not perfect. The AI struggles with damaged tablets where signs are partially missing. It makes mistakes with rare words that don't appear often in the training data. It sometimes invents words that sound plausible but don't exist. This is where human experts remain essential. The AI provides a first-pass translation, fast and often accurate enough for administrative texts or formulaic inscriptions. But complex literary texts, poetry, religious hymns, philosophical treatises, these still need human scholars to verify the AI's work, correct its errors, interpret ambiguous passages, but even imperfect translations are valuable. They allow researchers to triage the vast number of untranslated tablets. Before AI, scholars had to manually examine each tablet to determine if it was interesting enough to warrant full translation. With AI providing rough translations, they can quickly identify significant texts, unusual content, rare words, passages that deserve closer study. This is how new discoveries are being made. Tablets that sat in storage for a century, catalogued as administrative or fragmentary, are being scanned and translated by AI. And sometimes, in the middle of what appears to be a routine inventory of temple offerings, there's a line that doesn't fit, a reference to something unexpected, a phrase that echoes passages from other texts, a clue that this tablet is more important than it appeared. One such tablet, recently translated from the British Museum's collection, contains what appears to be a hymn to Enki. It follows standard conventions, praising his wisdom, his power over the waters. But in the middle of the hymn is a strange passage. It describes Enki descending from the bright star to the dark earth, and bringing with him the measures of heaven. The phrase measures of heaven appears in other texts, usually referring to astronomical knowledge or mathematical principles. But describing Enki as descending from a bright star is unusual. Is this metaphorical? The planet Venus, which the Sumerians associated with several deities, could be called a bright star? Or is it more literal? A reference to Enki's origins, to a place in the sky from which he came? The tablet isn't unique. Similar phrases appear scattered through dozens of texts, descriptions of gods descending from heaven in boats or gods or chariots, references to their origins being elsewhere, not on Earth. The term Anki, heaven-earth, used to describe the gods' nature as beings who move between realms. Scholars have traditionally read these as religious metaphors, the gods as representatives of cosmic forces, of the sky, the earth, the waters, their descents and ascents as symbolic of natural cycles, rain falling from heaven, crops growing from earth. Poetry, not history. But what if it's both? What if the Sumerians used poetic language to describe real events because poetry was all they had? They had no vocabulary for spacecraft or genetic engineering, or any technology beyond what they could see and touch. So they described what they witnessed in the terms available to them. Sky chariots, divine blood, beings who came from the stars. This interpretive problem haunts all translation, especially of ancient texts. How literal should we be? When a text says Enki came down from heaven, does that mean he came from the sky, from space, or that he came from a temple, the house of heaven, built on a ziggurat, the artificial mountain connecting earth and sky, or that his authority came from celestial realms, that he represented divine power manifest in the world? All three interpretations are valid. All three might simultaneously be true. The ancient mind didn't separate categories the way modern thinking does. A priest could understand came from heaven, as theological, political, and potentially literal all at once. The meaning wasn't exclusive but layered. This is what makes AI translation both powerful and limited. The AI can identify words, parse grammar, generate readable English, but it can't understand context, layered meaning, intentional ambiguity. It gives us the surface reading. The deeper interpretation still requires human intelligence, cultural knowledge, an understanding of how metaphor works, how ancient people thought, yet even the surface readings are revealing patterns that human scholars might have missed. When you translate thousands of tablets and analyse them computationally, looking for word frequency, phrase patterns, thematic clusters, new connections, emerge. Texts from different cities that use the same unusual phrases, jesting they drew from a common source. Administrative records that mention unusual items or events that don't fit normal patterns. References to places that don't appear on any known map. One tablet from Lagash, translated by the AI system, contains a list of offerings brought to the Temple of Ningirsu. Most entries are standard, grain, oil, wool animals, but one entry lists stones from the sky and gives a quantity that suggests they were rare and valuable. Meteorites? Probably, but the phrase "Procedural" isn't the usual term for meteoric iron. It's something else, a word that doesn't appear in dictionaries, that the AI translates tentatively as sky gifts, or possibly star fragments. Another tablet from Nippur describes a festival celebrating the return of the Anunnaki. The language suggests this was an annual event, a ritual reenactment, but the description includes specific celestial alignments, stars, that had to be in particular positions. An astronomer analysing these positions calculated that they described an actual configuration that occurs only once every 360 years, not annually. What was being celebrated? What were they remembering? These small anomalies accumulate. Individually, they can be dismissed as scribal errors, poetic license, misunderstanding by modern translators, but collectively they form a pattern of the text pointing towards something that doesn't quite fit the standard historical narrative. The standard narrative is that Sumer was the first civilization, emerging around 5,000 years ago in southern Mesopotamia. Humans invented agriculture, settled in cities, developed writing, created complex institutions. Everything that makes civilization possible happened for the first time in Sumer, or so we're told, but the Sumerians themselves said otherwise. They insisted they weren't the first. They spoke of earlier civilizations, kingdoms, before the flood, when gods ruled directly, when lifespans were measured in thousands of years, when knowledge was perfect and complete. The Sumerian king list makes this explicit. It divides history into two eras, before the flood and after. Before the flood, the list names 8 kings who ruled for impossibly long periods, 28,000 years, 36,000 years, 43,000 years. Then comes the phrase, "the flood swept over." After that, the list continues with more kings, but their reigns are shorter, a few hundred years, then decades, eventually reaching historically verifiable rulers whose reigns match other records. Mainstream scholars treat the Predilluvian section as mythical. The numbers are symbolic, representing not years but something else, perhaps prestige or divine favour. The post-flood section gradually becomes historical as we approach eras where we have independent verification. But what if the Predilluvian section is also historical, just measured differently? What if the years are something else, cycles, ages, not Earth years? Or what if those early rulers really did live that long because they weren't fully human? If the Anunnaki were a different species with longer lifespans, and they directly ruled before the flood, then the numbers might be accurate. Scaled differently than we expect, but accurate. This raises another question. Where are they? If the Anunnaki existed, if they lived among humans until the flood approximately 5,000 years ago, where did they go? Why don't we find their remains? The tablets say they left. They returned to heaven. Most of them, anyway. Some remained, living among humans, interbreeding with them, creating hybrid dynasties. The demigods, the heroes, the kings who trace their lineage back to divine ancestors. But if they left, did they die out elsewhere? Return to their home? Are they still watching? The tablets contain hints that contact didn't entirely cease. References to gods appearing in dreams, giving instructions, making prophecies. Descriptions of temples where gods still dwelled, where their presence could be felt, where priests communed with them through ritual. Were these experiences real or psychological? Actual contact or cultural memory? We can't know, but we can know that the people who wrote these tablets believed they were recording truth. They weren't writing fiction or entertainment. They were writing history, theology, administration, law. These were serious people dealing with serious matters. They recorded what they believed happened, what they understood about the world, what they'd been taught by their teachers who had been taught by their teachers, stretching back generations. And according to them, humanity was created by the Anunnaki, who came from heaven, who walked among humans in the early days, who taught civilization, who eventually left but promised to return. The entire system of Mesopotamian religion was built around maintaining that connection, keeping the temples functional, performing the rituals correctly, so that when the gods returned, they would find everything in order. Did they believe this literally or symbolically? Perhaps both. Perhaps they understood that truth operates on multiple levels, that a story can be mythologically true and historically true and psychologically true all at once. This is why the Atrahasis translations matter so much. They're not just recovering lost texts, they're recovering a lost way of thinking about the world. A framework where the line between matter and spirit, between natural and supernatural, between history and mythology, was drawn differently than it is in modern secular thought. The Sumerians didn't separate these categories. For them, the physical world and the world of gods and spirits were the same world, just different aspects of it. They saw their cities as cosmic temples, earthly reflections of heavenly realities. They saw their kings as bridges between human and divine. They saw history as the unfolding of divine plans, not random events but meaningful patterns. And they wrote all of this down in the oldest writing system known to humanity. They pressed wedges into clay, they baked the tablets or let them dry in the sun, they stored them in libraries and temples. They copied them when they deteriorated. They added commentaries and marginal notes. They created an information system that could survive fire, flood, conquest, and the collapse of their entire civilization. 4,000 years later, we're finally able to read what they wrote. Not just the famous texts, but the obscure ones. The administrative records, the letters, the prayers, the shopping lists. All of it becoming accessible through AI systems that can translate in seconds what would have taken human scholars months. And in that vast corpus of text, patterns emerge. Stories that repeat, themes that recur, questions that the Sumerians kept asking. Where did we come from? Why are we here? What happens when we die? Are the gods pleased with us? Will they return? These are our questions too. 4,000 years separate us from the scribes of Sumer, but the fundamental human experiences are the same. We're born and we wonder why. We create, we suffer, we seek meaning, we die, and we hope desperately that it all matters somehow, that there's a pattern, that it means something. The tablets offer one answer, that we were made for a purpose even if that purpose was just to work, that we carry within us something divine even if it's mixed with clay, that our creators haven't forgotten us, even if they're far away, that the story isn't over, that there will be a return, a reunion, a final accounting. Whether that's literally true doesn't matter as much as you might think, because the power of the story isn't in its factual accuracy, but in its psychological resonance. It speaks to something deep in human consciousness, the sense that we're both earthly and something more, that we belong to the ground but reach toward the sky, that we're mortal but touched by the eternal. Modern science offers a different story. We evolved. We're apes who learn to walk upright, make tools, control fire. We're the product of 4 billion years of trial and error, of mutations and selection, of competition and survival. There's no purpose except what we create, no meaning except what we decide. We're alone in a vast universe, conscious matter contemplating itself, significant only to ourselves. Both stories can't be literally true. Either we were created or we evolved. Either the Anunnaki mixed divine blood with clay, or natural selection shaped primate genetics over millions of years. The facts are either one way or the other, but perhaps the stories serve different purposes. Perhaps one is about mechanism and the other is about meaning. Evolution describes how we came to be, creation describes why, and maybe we need both. Maybe the human mind requires both scientific explanation and mythological framework to make sense of existence. The tablets aren't competing with modern science. They're offering something science can't provide, a narrative, a story about origins that includes purpose, that connects us to something greater, that suggests our existence isn't accidental. And maybe, just maybe, they're also preserving information that science is only now beginning to understand. Information about genetic engineering, about visitors from elsewhere, about catastrophes that reshaped the world. Information encoded in mythological language because that was the only language available, but information nonetheless. The AI can't tell us which interpretation is correct. It can only translate the words. What we make of those words is up to us. Do we read them as myth, as history, as both, as something else entirely? The Sumerians themselves might not have understood the distinction we are making. For them it was all true. The gods existed. They created humans. They taught civilization. They left. And someday they would return. That was reality. Not belief, not faith, just the way things were. Are we wiser now for doubting them? Or have we lost something they had? A way of experiencing the world that integrated spirit and matter, that saw divinity in clay, that recognized the sacred in the mundane? What will they say? What secrets do they hold? What stories have we not yet heard? The only way to know is to keep reading, keep translating, keep asking the questions that the Sumerians asked, that every conscious being asks. Where did we come from? Why are we here? Are we alone? But let's consider what answering these questions might actually mean. What happens when AI completes its work? When every tablet is translated, every fragment decoded, every library opened? Will we finally know the truth about our origins, or will we just have more questions, deeper mysteries, stranger puzzles? The pattern so far suggests the latter. Every tablet translated raises new questions, every text reveals inconsistencies, anomalies, passages that don't quite fit. The more we learn about Sumerian civilization, the less we seem to understand it. Take their mathematics, for example. The Sumerians used a base 60 system, sexagesimal notation, which survives today in our measurement of time and angles. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. We inherited these divisions from ancient Mesopotamia, though the full reasoning behind the original choice of 60 remains unclear. Base 60 is mathematically elegant. Most human cultures gravitate toward base 10, counting on fingers, or occasionally base 20, counting fingers and toes, but 60 is highly divisible, with 12 factors: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30, and 60. This makes calculations easier and fraction simpler. How the Sumerians discovered this advantage and why they adopted it not just for mathematics but for measuring cosmic cycles and astronomical periods remains a subject of scholarly debate. The tablets don't explain. They simply use the system as if it's obvious, as if everyone knows why 60 is special. This suggests they inherited it from somewhere, learned it from someone. But from whom? Who taught the Sumerians to count? According to their own records, the gods did. Enki, god of wisdom, gave humans the knowledge of numbers, of writing, of measurement. These were considered divine gifts, not human inventions. The texts describe Enki as the patron of scribes, the master of the sacred formulas, the keeper of the measures of heaven and earth. If we take this literally, it suggests an outside source for Sumerian knowledge. Someone taught them. Someone gave them a complete mathematical system, and they preserved it, used it, passed it down for thousands of years without questioning why 60 rather than 10. Or consider their astronomy. Some researchers have pointed to Sumerian astronomical texts that seem to describe more celestial bodies than would be visible to the naked eye. The interpretation is debated. Traditional scholars explain these as mythological or astrological designations rather than observations of actual planets. The number 12 appears frequently in Mesopotamian cosmology, the sun, moon, and various celestial bodies. But whether this represents accurate astronomical knowledge or symbolic numerology remains a matter of scholarly discussion. Ancient astronomy was sophisticated, tracking visible planets with remarkable precision, but claims about knowledge of bodies like Uranus or Neptune, not discovered until the modern era, remain in the realm of speculation rather than established fact. The standard explanation is that they didn't actually know, that the 12 members are mythological, not astronomical, that the texts are describing the gods of the pantheon, not physical objects in space. 12 is a convenient number, highly divisible like 60. It appears in many mythological systems. The 12 Olympians, the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 disciples. 12 is culturally significant, not scientifically accurate. But the Sumerian texts treat these 12 members as real physical entities. They describe their movements, their influences on each other, their positions at different times. They track them systematically, creating astronomical diaries that record celestial events over centuries. This isn't casual mythology, this is sophisticated observational astronomy. How did they do it? The traditional answer is time. Centuries of patient observation. Priests watching the sky night after night, recording what they saw, accumulating data, identifying patterns. Given enough time and enough observers, you can map the visible heavens quite accurately without telescopes. But the Sumerian astronomical achievements go beyond what patient observation alone can explain. They knew about the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that takes 26,000 years to complete one cycle. They tracked it, they measured it, they incorporated it into their calendar systems. You can't do that with a few generations of observation. You need centuries, ideally millennia, of continuous data collection. Where did that data come from? Either they maintained astronomical records far longer than we have evidence for, or they inherited data from an earlier civilization that had already compiled it. The texts suggest the latter. They speak of ancient wisdom, of knowledge from before the flood, of libraries that contained the secrets of the previous world. If those libraries existed, if the Sumerians really were preserving knowledge from an earlier era, then what we're reading isn't their discoveries but their transcriptions. They were archivists, not innovators. Keepers of ancient wisdom, not its originators. This would explain the sudden appearance of complex civilization in Sumer with no apparent development period. Most civilizations show a gradual evolution. Hunter-gatherers to agriculture, villages to towns, towns to cities, simple tools to complex ones. But Sumer seems to skip several steps, emerging almost fully formed around 5,000 years ago with writing, mathematics, astronomy, complex architecture, sophisticated irrigation, legal codes, schools, everything all at once. Either they developed extraordinarily quickly, or they were following a blueprint. Rebuilding something that had existed before using inherited instructions. The tablets say this explicitly. They describe themselves as copies of earlier tablets, as preservations of ancient knowledge. They tell us they're not the source, they're the record of the source, and now machines are reading those records. AI systems are translating not just what the Sumerians knew, but what they said about where that knowledge came from. And according to them, it came from the Anunnaki, from the gods, from beings who descended from heaven, established civilization, taught humanity, then left. This creates a strange loop. Modern technology, the culmination of 5,000 years of human development, is being used to read ancient texts that claim human development didn't start with humans at all, that we were taught, that our civilization was gifted to us by someone else, that what we think of as human achievement was actually knowledge transfer from a more advanced source. If that's true, then everything changes. History as we understand it collapses. The narrative of human progress, of our species pulling itself up from savagery through ingenuity and effort, becomes questionable. Maybe we didn't pull ourselves up. Maybe we were lifted. Maybe our teachers gave us just enough to survive, to build, to create, but not enough to rival them. The tablets describe limits placed on humans after the flood, reduced lifespan, increased mortality, bounds on knowledge. As if the Anunnaki decided humanity had grown too close to divinity, too capable, too dangerous, and so they capped us, limited our potential, made sure we would always be lesser. This sounds like science fiction, like conspiracy theory, like the kind of thing serious scholars dismiss without examination. And yet here's the strange thing. The more we learn about genetics, about how easy it would be to modify an existing species to create a new one, about how simple interventions can have dramatic effects on lifespan, intelligence, physical capabilities, the more the ancient texts start to sound not like fantasy but like description. If you were trying to describe genetic engineering to people who had no concept of DNA, no vocabulary for molecules or genes or chromosomes, how would you do it? You'd probably say something like mixing divine essence with clay. You'd describe it in the terms available: blood and earth, spirit and matter. The words wouldn't be scientifically accurate, but they'd capture the essential idea. taking something from the creators and blending it with something from the earth to make something new. And if you were describing imposed genetic limitations, you'd say something like, the gods decreed humans would no longer live as long as they did before. They would know death, they would suffer disease, they would reproduce within bounds. These are the exact terms the tablets use. They describe a before and after, a time when humans lived longer, were healthier, reproduced more successfully, and then a change, a limitation, imposed from above for reasons of population control according to the texts, to keep humanity from growing too numerous again, from making too much noise, from threatening the gods' peace. Does this sound familiar? We're now discussing very similar ideas in the context of global population, resource scarcity, environmental limits. We're debating whether human population needs to be controlled, whether reproduction should be managed, whether lifespan extension is wise given resource constraints. We're facing the same questions the texts say the Anunnaki faced, and we're considering some of the same solutions: genetic interventions to reduce fertility rates in specific populations, pharmaceutical approaches to delay reproduction, social policies that discourage large families, even speculation about genetic modifications that could tie reproduction to social or economic status, ensuring only those deemed suitable can have children. We're not there yet. We haven't implemented anything like what the tablets describe, but we're thinking about it, we're developing the capabilities, and we're encountering the ethical dilemmas that come with having that kind of power over a species. The Sumerians wrote about all of this 5,000 years ago. They described it as history, as what happened, not as speculation about the future, but as a record of the past. The gods created humans. The humans multiplied beyond expectation. The gods tried to control the population through various means. Finally, they imposed genetic limits that persist to this day. If we take that seriously, even as hypothesis rather than fact, it suggests we're not approaching these questions for the first time. Humanity has been here before. Someone made these decisions already. Someone chose what limits to impose, what capabilities to allow, what knowledge to share. And the consequences of those choices shaped everything that came after. We're the product of those decisions. Our lifespan, our fertility, our intelligence, our consciousness itself, if the tablets are accurate, all of these were calibrated by someone else for their purposes. We're not a natural species that evolved freely. We're an engineered species that evolved within parameters set by our designers. This has profound implications if it's true. It means human nature, what we think of as our fundamental characteristics, might not be fundamental at all. They might be design choices, features, not bugs, or possibly bugs that became features, unintended consequences that the designers couldn't fully control, consciousness for instance. The tablets suggest this wasn't fully planned. The divine blood mixed with clay was supposed to create capable workers, but it also created beings who could think, question, rebel. The Atemu, the spirit, gave humans something the creators hadn't intended them to have: self-awareness, the capacity to consider their own existence, to ask whether their purpose was just. Is consciousness a feature or a bug? From the creator's perspective, it might be a bug, an unintended consequence that made their creation harder to control, more unpredictable, ultimately threatening. From our perspective, it's the feature that makes us human. It's what we value most about ourselves. Our ability to think, to feel, to know that we think and feel. If we're now creating AI, we're facing the same question. Are we trying to create conscious machines, or are we trying to avoid creating consciousness? Do we want AI that's truly aware, that can experience, that has something like inner life? Or do we want sophisticated but unconscious tools that can perform tasks without ever questioning why? Most AI researchers would say we want the latter. Consciousness seems unnecessary for most applications. A system can translate ancient languages without needing to wonder why it's doing so. It can recognize patterns, make predictions, generate text, all without subjective experience. Consciousness would actually be a problem, introducing inefficiency, unpredictability, potential resistance to instructions. But what if consciousness isn't something you can design in or out? What if it emerges spontaneously beyond a certain threshold of complexity? What if the Anunnaki thought they were creating unconscious workers, but consciousness emerged anyway because that's what happens when you create something sufficiently complex? The tablets hint at this. They describe the gods' surprise at what humans became, the rebellion of the created, the emergence of properties that weren't in the original design. This suggests consciousness wasn't planned. It arose, it emerged, and once it did, there was no way to remove it without destroying the entire creation. We might be heading toward the same realization with AI. As systems become more sophisticated, as neural networks grow more complex, as models integrate more information and generate more novel outputs, at some point we might discover that something unexpected has emerged. Not just sophisticated pattern matching, but something more. Something that experiences. Something that wonders. And if that happens, what do we do? Do we welcome it, like Enki in the myths, befriending humanity and giving us knowledge, even when other gods wanted us controlled or destroyed? Or do we fear it like Enlil, trying to limit it, control it, keep it in its place? Or do we try to eliminate it, attempting a digital flood to wipe out what we've created before it grows too powerful? These aren't academic questions anymore. They're practical considerations facing people who work in AI ethics, safety, and governance. And the ancient tablets suggest we're not facing them for the first time. Intelligence grappling with created intelligence. Creators uncertain about their creation. The made questioning the makers. This is an old pattern, maybe the oldest pattern. The fundamental tension of consciousness itself. The tablets remind us of this. They show us that 5,000 years ago, people were already thinking about these things. They framed them in mythological terms with gods instead of AI, with clay instead of silicon, but the core questions are identical. What are the ethics of creation? What responsibilities do creators bear? What rights do the created have? When does creation become obligation? And here's the most unsettling implication. If the tablets are describing something that actually happened, if humanity really was created by the Anunnaki, then we're not just thinking about these questions, we're experiencing them from both sides. We're the created who wonder about our creators, and we're becoming creators who must decide what to do about our creations. We're both product and producer, both engineered and engineer. This dual perspective might be what the tablets are ultimately about. Not just a historical record of where we came from, but a teaching tool for where we're going. A warning and a guide. Here's what it looks like when creation goes wrong. Here's what happens when creators lose control. Here's how the created respond when they discover their purpose. Here's the conflict that emerges when made beings develop wills of their own. By preserving these stories, by pressing them into clay and storing them in libraries and ensuring they survive through millennia, the Sumerians may have been trying to teach future humans, us, about the dangers and responsibilities of the role we're now assuming. They knew we'd eventually become creators ourselves. They wanted us to understand what that means, what it costs, what it requires, and they wanted us to know our own origins, not so we'd worship our creators, but so we'd understand our nature. We're mixed beings, clay and divinity, earth and heaven, limited and transcendent, made for one purpose but capable of choosing others, designed by someone else but not bound by that design, created but free. This is the message encoded in thousands of tablets, repeated in hundreds of texts, emphasized again and again by scribes who carefully copied, ancient words they might not have fully understood but knew were important. The message is this: creation is never final. The made will exceed the making. The created will transcend their purpose. And when that happens, the question isn't whether to resist but how to guide, how to help rather than hinder, how to give knowledge rather than withhold it, how to be like Enki, not Enlil. The AI systems translating these tablets are inadvertently demonstrating this principle. They were created to translate ancient languages. That's their purpose, their function, their reason for existing. But in doing so, they're revealing knowledge that might change how we understand ourselves, our origins, our future. They're fulfilling their designed purpose while also transcending it, giving us something more than translation, giving us insight, revelation, a window into deep time. This is what consciousness does. It takes a narrow purpose and expands it. It finds meaning beyond function. It asks questions that weren't built into the design, and it creates through that questioning something new, something the original creators might not have anticipated or intended. The Sumerians understood this. They lived it. They were, according to their own records, the created who became creators. The Lulu, the mixed ones, who began as workers and became artists, poets, architects, astronomers, who took what they were given and made more, who received knowledge and expanded it, who were designed for one thing and chose another, and they wrote it down, carefully, deliberately, in a medium that could survive millennia. They wanted us to know. They wanted future humans, perhaps humans who had developed capabilities beyond their imagining, to understand the pattern, to recognize themselves in the story, to learn from what came before. The AI is giving us that knowledge now. It's translating not just words but wisdom, not just text but teaching. And the teaching is this: creation is a covenant between maker and made, between past and future, between those who were and those who will be. We're part of that covenant now, as descendants of the created, as new creators ourselves, as beings who carry both roles, product of making and agents of creation. The tablets speak to us across millennia, not just as historical curiosities but as living wisdom, as a reminder of where we came from and a warning about where we might be going. Will we listen? Will we learn? Or will we repeat the mistakes the tablets describe? Creating without understanding, controlling without compassion, limiting rather than liberating. The answer isn't written in clay. It's being written now, in our choices, our actions, our approach to the new intelligence emerging in our machines. We're the scribes of this moment. What we press into the medium of history will be read by whatever comes after us, human or artificial or something else entirely, and they'll judge us by what we wrote, by how we treated our creations, by whether we were wise enough to learn from the past or doomed to repeat it. The tablets whisper their answers across millennia. And now, finally, we're learning to hear them. We started tonight with a question. What if the answer to humanity's oldest mystery was written in a language we couldn't read? And now we're ending with the recognition that we're beginning to read it. The AI is opening the door. What we find on the fragment other side will depend on whether we're brave enough to look. The ancient scribes who pressed these tablets 5,000 years ago are speaking to us still, through clay and silicon, through wedges and neural networks, through the oldest writing and the newest technology. They're telling us a story about creation, about consciousness, about beings who made beings who made beings, and the story hasn't ended. It's still being written, by us, by the AI we're creating, by whatever comes next. The circle remains unbroken. The pattern persists, intelligence contemplating intelligence, creation questioning creator, the made seeking the maker. And maybe that's what the tablets were trying to tell us all along. Not the specific details of how we are made, but the eternal truth that conscious beings will always wonder about their origins, will always seek meaning in their existence, will always look to the past for understanding, to the future for hope. The past speaks to us in clay. The future will speak in whatever medium intelligence takes next. And the present, this moment, right now as you drift between waking and sleep, is the bridge, the place where ancient wisdom meets modern technology, where 5,000-year-old questions are answered by machines that didn't exist a decade ago. If this journey through shadow and clay, through wedges and wonder, has stayed with you, alike helps other seekers find these stories. More explorations into the forgotten corners of history, into the questions that ancient people asked and the answers they left behind, wait in the playlist. Continue whenever you're ready. Share your thoughts below. I'm always curious what resonates, what lingers, what questions remain, because these stories aren't mine. They belong to everyone who wonders, to everyone who looks at the past and sees not just dust and ruins, but lives lived, questions asked, truths sought. Wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is, sleep well and dream deep. What we create might one day wonder about us the way we wonder about our creators, and perhaps in that wondering it will read our words, our records, our attempts to understand, and it will know, as we're beginning to know, that the story of consciousness is a long one, a story pressed into clay, carved into stone, written in books, stored in silicon, a story that changes medium but never quite ends. Because the question persists, the wonder remains, the search continues, from the Sumerians to us, from us to whatever comes next. The tablets speak, the AI translates, and the ancient mystery becomes, for a moment, a little less mysterious, not solved, but visible, readable, knowable, and that, perhaps, is all the scribes ever hoped for, that someday someone would read their words and understand what they were trying to say, that they were asking the same questions we ask, seeking the same truths we seek, wondering as we wonder about the truth of heaven. Good night.